Which should America pursue? Should we pursue a diplomatic outcome in the war between Russia and Ukraine, or should we seek an escalation of the conflict? Now, it would seem on the surface to be a rhetorical, silly question with an obvious answer. You want to end the war. Unfortunately, with actions, it's not quite so clear cut. There does seem to be some attempts at diplomacy, but it doesn't seem like it's going quite in the right direction. And there is a lot at stake here. So we have brought in today somebody to try to unpack some of this. One of the best ones we've had in here, Ambassador Chaz Freeman, former U.S. Ambassador, senior State Department and Defense Department official. Really, you've done it all in the past. So welcome back to the show, Mr. Ambassador.
Glad to be with you, Danny.
Well, listen, a lot of things have been happening since I guess we've had you on last. And some of it troubling, some of it, well, actually, it's all troubling. Some of the most recent kinetic events we had, and we'll talk about this more in a second. Last Friday, Vladimir Putin came out and said, if long-range weapons are used, because Zelinskys has been asking for this for a long time, and the U.S. has apparently given serious consideration to it, he said he will regard that as a direct involvement of the United States or Britain or France against Russia. He said it would be a direct state of war, is how he put it, which he actually used that term, which I thought was noteworthy by itself. Now, since that time, overnight, I think it was, there was a big explosion in the Tver region where a huge ammo dump was blown up. And according to most of the reports I've seen, they say that this was not a missile strike. So it was not one of these long-range missiles, but a long-range drone strike. And from what I've been able to put together from various sources, even on the Russian side, they say, yes, Ukraine launched a wave of drones that most of them were shot down, but enough got through to cause this massive explosion on this huge ammo depot, which is no doubt going to hurt Russia. The question right now is on everybody's mind is, what is Putin going to do about this? And does that cross a red line? Does that meet the threshold he mentioned on the previous Friday? We don't know about that. He hasn't said anything further. But just kind of a general, how do you see the current situation bubbling between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, the strikes on deep into Russia certainly boost Ukrainian morale and gratify Ukraine's foreign backers, whose objective is to hurt Russia, to weaken and isolate it, as Secretary of Defense Austin put it. But it is essentially almost irrelevant to what is happening on the real battlefield, which is in Ukraine, with a little sideshow at Kursk. And I would say, with regard to Kursk, there's been a serious misinterpretation of this. It's directly analogous to Robert E. Lee's attack on Gettysburg, invasion of Pennsylvania, which he carried out to buck up sagging Southern morale, to demoralize the North in the Civil War, and he thought of it as something that might lead to the capitulation of the North and end the war in the South's favor. And it was tactically brilliant, but it was strategically disastrous for the South, and it accelerated their defeat. And I think the same thing's happened with Kursk. The best Ukrainian forces, their best equipment have gone into Kursk. They're being mopped up now, basically. The Russians stood back for a long time and hit them from the air and with artillery. Now they're on the ground recovering territory. So that's going on. And of course, if Russian ammunition is diminished, if the supplies are cut by strikes at ammo depots of the sort that happened at Tver, that is certainly a factor, but it's not a decisive factor. What is happening diplomatically is pretty unclear, except in the case of the Russians. Putin's statement that the authorization of direct strikes by NATO-manned and directed equipment, missiles, weapons, maybe ATACMS, maybe missiles, cruise missiles like the Storm Shadow from Britain or the equivalent from France, that this would result in a state of war with NATO and the United States. This is a very significant statement. We've forgotten in this country what a state of war is because the Congress defaults on its responsibility to manage war and peace, defaults to the executive branch, which does what it pleases. But a state of war is a legal situation in which domestically you can impose martial law. Internationally, you can take any action you need to take against the other party. So this is a big threat. And what it signals is that if the United States and NATO escalate, as appears to be the intention, many people are saying that it will be announced at the meeting of Zelinskys and President Biden at the United Nations General Assembly in a few days, then Mr. Putin is signaling, President Putin is signaling that there will be a major change in Russian strategy. And whether this involves an accelerated effort to take Ukrainian territory or an augmented effort, and where that effort is directed, whether it's directed at Odessa in the south, or whether it's directed at Kiev, or whether it's directed simply at the Western Ukrainian bastion of the ultranationalist factions who control the government in Kiev, is very unclear. And it's also unclear what sort of retaliation against the West will be undertaken by the Russians. They threatened it. I think they put themselves in a position where they have to make good on their threats. But how they will do that, whether with cyber attacks or with missiles or with a demonstrative nuclear strike somewhere, I don't know.
So let's look at let's in terms of what Zelinskys trying to get, because there seems to be some confusion, even on the diplomatic front, of exactly what they're trying to accomplish. Because on the one hand, talking about authorizing or releasing any restrictions on the use of long-range missiles into Russia, it would seem that you're talking about expanding the war. But then at the other hand, he also seems to now be talking about a negotiated settlement. He said to Fareed Zakaria a couple of days ago that he views his victory plan as being something to look strong so that he can be in a good negotiating position. But yesterday, he said this.
Our plan for victory is fully prepared. All points, all key emphases, the necessary appendices with details to the plan have been identified. Everything has been worked out. The most important thing now is the determination to implement it. There is and can be no alternative to peace, no freezing of the war, or any other manipulations that will simply shift Russian aggression to another stage.
So if he's saying we want to be strong for negotiations, but there is no freezing of the war, and they're not going to allow Russia to do anything else, don't you kind of have to be in a position of superior military strength in order to issue those kinds of terms?
It sounds a bit like a desperate straddle of a chasm in Ukrainian politics. I think it's very clear that the majority of Ukrainians, in fact, do want a negotiated settlement, but they have unrealistic objectives, like recovering Crimea, which is inhabited by people who have no interest in being part of Ukraine, and made that clear on a number of occasions before the Russians finally annexed them. And the same with the Donbass, which is Russian populated and does not feel comfortable under the ultranationalist government in Kyiv. He's not in a strong position. So this suggests one of two things. Either he's planning a major escalation in connection with the West, or he's engaged in bravado for domestic political purposes. Because the reality is that Ukraine has basically run out of cannon fodder, and it doesn't have the capacity to hold the ground in the Donbass. In fact, it is engaged in an accelerating retreat from the prepared positions that it had constructed in Donbass. And as I mentioned, in Kursk, it is being badly mauled. And I don't know how many of the very fine troops that Ukraine sent there will in fact make it back to Ukraine. But the fact is that there is growing interest internationally, and I mean, not just in the majority of the world, which has always been opposed to this war, but in the West, some countries in the EU, many people in the United States, one presidential candidate, Donald Trump, and a lot of interest in a negotiated solution to this war, which will have to acknowledge what Russia has accomplished on the battlefield. It has to be realistic. Mr. Zelensky is not talking realistically. He has, however, given ground. Instead of running so-called peace conferences, which are actually pep rallies with the Russians absent, he's now proposing peace conferences in which the Russians are present. One has to assume that there had been quite a bit going on in the back channels between Moscow and Kiev before the attack on Kursk. Certainly the Russian reaction was that negotiations are now off the table. This is a very dangerous moment for both Ukrainians and Russians, and by extension for us and our European allies.
And in fact, let me just show you what the Russian view of, especially since the Kursk invasion or incursion, rather. Here's what Foreign Minister Lavrov said specifically about Zelensky's plan.
The Zelinskys initiative is well known, and everyone already got tired of that because it's an ultimatum. The fact that he's tried to stick to this ultimatum means only one thing. The West does not want to have a fair agreement. The West wants to go on with doing everything to bring Russia closer, as they hope, to the situation where they can declare that they have inflicted strategic defeat to us on the battlefield. They want to see their competition weaker. So as for the Zelensky formula, we have never taken it seriously. We were only amazed at the fact that someone bought into it after the Western pressure, of course.
So he referred to what your comment there a second ago that Austin had said earlier in the war, that they want the strategic defeat and to weaken Russia, which he dismisses. And you've already painted the picture that the offensive in the Kursk area is already starting to be shrunk backwards, and they continue to lose ground in the east as well. So it just seems odd that you're pinning your hopes for a negotiated settlement on something that can't be accomplished, because then the question comes in, when he goes and talks to Biden, apparently in days from now, and he puts whatever his detailed plan on the ground is, that's not connected to the ground truth realities, what is President Biden going to be able to do about that?
Well, there have been many questions about how realistic Mr. Biden is and has been about the situation in Ukraine. He's clearly been in the grips of people, neoconservative people who harbor grave delusions about what could happen. And if you look at their predictions, well, first of all, we had intelligence predictions, which were totally wrong, that the Russians would just walk over the Ukrainians. And then we had a moment of irrational exuberance on the part of the proponents of war. Oh, the Ukrainians are going to walk all over the Russians. That is not what has happened. And the casualties now are widely acknowledged in this war to have been over 1 million people. The majority of those are Ukrainians, the vast majority, because the Russian strategy in the war has been to stand back in a defensive mode and grind the attackers into bits, which they have largely done. They're now on the offensive, both in Kursk and in the Donbass, in a way that they were not for the previous 2 years of the war. So this is a change. But I think Mr. Lavrov is saying something very important, and that is that Russia believes, and there's a lot of evidence for this, that the West doesn't give a fig about Ukraine or Ukrainians. What it cares about is injuring Russia, cutting Russia down to size, perhaps engineering regime change in Russia, perhaps breaking Russia up into its component parts. This is an existential threat to Russia. And therefore, it justifies an extreme response. The fact that the Russians have been as restrained as they have been is, in my view, somewhat miraculous. I cannot imagine the United States, if we were invaded from Mexico, or if foreign troops were firing missiles at us from Mexico, doing as little as the Russians have done in response so far. So
And
this is a warning that we may be entering a state of war, which is a new legal and political environment, and we may be about to provoke the massive response on Ukraine that the Russians have heretofore refrained from engaging in.
now, congruent with that view, Lavrov, subsequent to that comment, made another comment to where he talked about their nuclear doctrine, which has been something that's periodically come up throughout this war from the Russian side. But there was a difference here, and I wonder if you can tell me any diplomatese. Is there a significance to this change where he talks about updating their nuclear doctrine? Watch this.
Запад не хочет избежать эскалации. Запад, по-русски говоря, нарывается. Очень важно понимать, что у нас есть своя доктрина, в том числе доктрина использования ядерного оружия, которая, кстати, сейчас уточняется, и о которой американским деятелям очень хорошо известно. И мы сейчас еще раз подтверждаем, что игра с огнем, а они, как дети малые, со спичками балуются, это очень опасная штука для взрослых дяденек и тетенек, которым доверено ядерное оружие в той или иной западной стране.
So his basic premise there is that we've had this nuclear weapons, but now we're adjusting the nuclear doctrine. The Americans know about this. What do you take away from his highlighting the fact that it's been adjusted? What does that mean?
Well, it means that all bets are off because we don't know precisely what the adjustments are. I have to assume, based on what he said and on the normal practice of diplomats in these situations, that there have been back-channel communications with the White House, possibly with London, and about these adjustments, and that may account for the sudden reversal of the apparent intent of Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, and President Biden to announce a change in policy on long-range strikes during their recent meeting in Washington. They didn't do that, suggesting that there was some kind of communication that unnerved them or required serious consideration. So I think he's saying something very important, but it's still obscure. And I think when and if the Russians do publish a new nuclear doctrine, I presume it will lower the threshold at which they are prepared to use nuclear weapons. In other words, it will bring us closer to a nuclear exchange than we have been. I think there's justified concern widely internationally about the possibility that the people on our side, and many in Congress, for example, who claim that the Russians are paper tigers, they'll never do anything, it's safe to do anything you want to them because we're so powerful, and so forth and so on. But these people are, as he said, playing with fire or matches, and they are behaving like children, not adults. They are very unrealistic.
And you know, if you just have some pundits saying some of those things, you could maybe dismiss it because you can say, well, they don't know any better, and they're just hotheads. They're just giving their opinions. And I'm going to show some of those in a minute. But we've also seen it, as we've covered in recent shows here. You had 5 former defense secretaries from the UK say, yes, get rid of this. You had a whole list to include Ben Hodges, General Hodges, whom we had on here yesterday, actually saying the same thing: release all of the restrictions, oblivious to what Lavrov is saying here, which basically says what you just said there, that even these allegedly intelligent people who are specifically trained in foreign policy and military policy are saying, don't worry about it. Ignore it. It doesn't make any difference. Hodges expressly said on our show yesterday, there's zero chance that Russia would use nuclear weapons. He actually believes that. But now here, then, you also talked about members of Congress. Here's what Ted Cruz said a couple of days ago. First time we've had him on the show, but here's what he's saying.
every enemy of America right now is stronger, and I think we're at greater jeopardy than we ever have been. And the problem is Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, their approach to the enemies of America is what you just said. It is appeasement, appeasement, appeasement. And communist China has now gotten in bed with Russia and Putin. That's bad for America. You look at their appeasement of Venezuela, their appeasement of Iran. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, along with congressional Democrats, have flowed $100 billion to Iran. That is profoundly dangerous, and I think we need a foreign policy that takes our enemies seriously and that invests in defending this country.
Appeasement, appeasement, appeasement. Everywhere you look, it's appeasement. So anything that apparently doesn't involve using kinetic operations and actions against our adversary is appeasement. How's that going to play in Russia?
Well, it won't surprise them because they understand that the United States has forgotten how to do diplomacy. You know, there are many ways to reduce a threat. The cheapest, the most effective generally, is to persuade the other side that's threatening you that there is no reason to do so, or that if they do so, they will pay a heavy price, which makes it not worth it. Diplomacy is the preferred mechanism for reducing threats to countries generally, not to the United States. The only way that we know how to deal with foreign issues is through the use of force. So we now have, there are a lot of things that you can't cure with the use of force. And in fact, it's been quite a while since we won a war. And the maximum pressure that we've put on, you mentioned Iran, is driving Iran to nuclear latency and possibly to an active nuclear weapons program. It's already driven North Korea to that level. But we don't have a diplomatic dialogue with the Russians. We don't talk to them. So I don't know what sort of appeasement he's talking about. We have no dialogue worth the word with the Chinese. And we're not talking to Venezuela. We're trying to do regime change there. This is nonsense. What it is an extremely naive, hubristic approach to the world. If you threaten people, which is what military deterrence does, unless it's accompanied by reassurance. In other words, if you behave the way we think you ought to, you will gain something. You won't lose anything. We don't do that. No, it's our way or the highway. And that's exactly the sort of discussion that's going on in neoconservative and foolish political circles here at home about Ukraine. Let's just escalate. Nothing will happen. Well, this reminds me in a way of how World War II started in the Pacific. We decided that we could do anything we wanted to Japan. We cut off their supplies of oil and iron. And we thought that would sober them up. And it got their attention.
Yeah, it did get
They
their
responded at Pearl Harbor. Sooner or later, you push people into a corner, they react in a way that you don't want. And that's one of the reasons you have to keep talking to the other side, because they'll do something that surprises you unpleasantly if you don't.
And I guess kind of to reinforce that. So this is, and I don't know, we've used him before, and a lot of people will roll their eyes to the mention of his name, but General Jack Keane, who was a 4-star general, and at least by the public is recognized as, well, he must know what he's talking about. He was a 4-star general, and he's on TV all the time. So unfortunately, people listen to him. But he also illustrates in the clip that I'm about to show a real blind spot, I think, even to the neoconservative side, about either a willful blurring of the facts or actually just a blind spot, and they're not aware of them, because he's going to talk about this growing nexus between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, and not exactly seeing the reasons for it. Watch this.
What has fundamentally changed from one administration to the other is Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea working together, collaborating, coordinating, and truly helping each other. And the fact that they perceive the United States as being weak, and they're going to take advantage of it. So they have been incentivized by their perception of us. It's no isolated event that there's war in Europe for the first time since World War II on a major scale, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. No accident that or isolated event than what's taken place in the Middle East, where Iran has operationalized all of their proxies to stranglehold Israel into making people stop living there and destroy the state of Israel and push the United States out of the region.
This is almost anti-diplomacy, because this is not only we're not, like you just said, talking to people to try to find the lowest cost to actually get things the way we want them to. We're actually ignoring anything they say, and then ignoring all of our actions or contributing actions, because the way he just characterized things there is that Russia out of nowhere invaded Ukraine, that Iran out of nowhere is employing all this stuff into the Middle East, like they're just lusting for war, and only the United States, being militaristic, can hold back the hordes. What do you say to that?
He says they see the United States as weak. They see the United States as strong and aggressive. That is why they have come together. You know, it was an escalation in Ukraine that caused Vladimir Putin to go to Pyongyang and sign up the North Koreans. It has been the war in Ukraine and the escalations by NATO and the United States that pushed Iran and Russia together. They're traditional enemies. And China and Russia have been pushed together because we have been very aggressive at both ends of the Eurasian landmass. We have been pushing for NATO enlargement, stationing American weapons on the Russian border, pretty much in Europe. And in Asia, we are accelerating our defense preparations for Taiwan, which is the product of a Chinese unfinished civil war. So they are reacting. I don't think we would react any differently if we were being encircled. And the notion that somehow they see us as weak and that's causing this is so parochial and moronic that it scarcely deserves comment. It's totally delusional. So this is the mentality of the United States, having militarized our foreign policy. So we have no other instrument of statecraft with which to deal with perceived threats. And, you know, we've adopted, and apparently maybe about to adopt, an even more extreme version of economic nationalism, protectionism, and separation from the world. You know, think about it for a moment. What is protectionism? It is an admission that you can't compete, that you have to impede competition by others because you can't match it without a handicap in the form of a tax called a tariff on imports, or in the form of a total ban on imports of one sort or another. So this is not I have to say that my perception indeed is that we are not as strong as we imagine we are, and we're much less strong than the Russians and Chinese and North Koreans and Iranians believe we are.
Well, and toward that end, there was an unexpected and I think unintended admission of exactly that point of how weak we are militarily because of this foreign policy that is global in nature that we've set out, that trying to take on all these strong forces in all the different areas simultaneously. But we're having a hard time even funding one of them. And in Kiev last week, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, was asked about some of our ability to provide long-range weapons. Watch this.
Ukraine was running short of air defense interceptors. So I sat down with my team and I said, where are we sending Patriot missiles and AMRAAM missiles around the world in the next 12 months? And I was told there's a whole list of countries we're sending them to. And I said, take every single one of those missiles, every one, and send them to Ukraine. That was not an easy thing to do. It required us to get our allies and partners to come along. Frankly, it required our bureaucracy to come along. And we are currently working on a substantial package, pulling together a range of different capabilities that we are going to try to get out the door before the end of this month.
So you subsequently, additionally, had Secretary of Defense Austin also say, hey, we're not holding back long-range weapons because we don't want to give them to Ukraine. We don't have them. And the British and the French also don't have that many. So there is a capacity issue here. And if we're admitting that publicly, I'm pretty sure that Moscow is paying attention, and anybody else is, when they're calculating their next moves.
There are a couple of factors here. One is obviously we have demonstrated conclusively in this war in Ukraine that we do not have the production and surge capacity that helped us to be a major factor with the Soviet Union in defeating the Nazis and Japanese and the Italians in World War II. We don't have that capacity. Second, what Jake Sullivan just described is our disarmament of much of the world in favor of Ukraine. This reminds me, I remember very well when we opened to China, Joe and I, talking with Henry Kissinger, criticized Soviet strategy. He said, it's like they're trying to kill 10 fleas simultaneously with 10 fingers. They're totally overextended. Well, we are overextended, and we're demonstrating that. That's what Jake Sullivan's effort to strip supplies of defensive weapons to our allies implies.
Well, now, what is going to be the reaction of that in Russia? Because we've just seen that Vladimir Putin has just given a decree to expand his active forces to 1.5 million. And their total military forces are apparently going to be about 2.4 million, 1.5 active army, it appears. Their definitions aren't entirely clear, but the number of troops for sure is. And they've been growing them really since, I guess it was November of 2022 when they first did a partial mobilization, and then they subsequently started going on a recruitment drive, which has enabled them to continue to grow to the side, even despite the losses that they've had here. So if he's doing this, then they're making these comments that we've seen already from both Lavrov and Ryabkov, and said some other things that, you guys aren't taking us seriously. When they see comments like this from Sullivan, and certainly whatever they can get on their own intelligence sources, might that not give them the, I don't know, confidence or something to contemplate actually taking the war laterally in the event that we do more strikes into Russia?
Well, they've concluded we do not have the capacity to conduct or win a war of attrition. So that may be what's on offer. But there's another implication, and that is if we are constrained by production blockages and inadequacies, how about some sabotage? If we're blowing up ammunition dumps in Russia, what about the ammunition dumps that are in the West, if there are any left that haven't been sent to Ukraine yet? This is a case of escalation on our part, inviting counter-escalation on the other side. And that's what we're getting. The idea that this was all going to somehow isolate and weaken Russia has proved to be utter nonsense. It's not isolated. It is reoriented toward China, toward India, toward the Middle East, or toward Africa, where it is more influential than it ever has been for years. It is not weakened when you're increasing your armed forces in the manner that he's ordered. This is not a weakening. When your military industrial production goes up by a factor of 10, that is not weakening. So when your economy is booming and growing, and you have gone from a backward economy to the largest economy in purchasing power terms in Europe, that is not weakening. So what's the calculus here?
Well,
we want a war of attrition? We're not capable of conducting it.
And not only is Putin expanding in the military realm, he's also expanding in the economic/diplomatic realm with Xi Jinping, like you just mentioned ago, because here coming up in, 5 or 6 weeks, they're going to have the BRICS summit, which they're going to, while most reports are going to expand their economic bloc a little bit larger. And apparently a bunch of others are coming to consider doing that as well. Quite a number of states are going to be attending that as observers. And so when you're talking about every aspect of it, Russia is, as you say, gaining in every sphere. So one of the speculations I've seen among a number of people recently is that this BRICS summit is so important to Xi Jinping, maybe more so than it is to Putin, even, that they don't want to take any overt military action, especially if this thing expands sideways, until after that summit. Do you see that there's a risk that Russia would not do something until that time, but might do something afterward?
the looming American election is a big factor in many foreign countries' thinking. I think it's one reason that Iran has not conducted the promised reprisal against various Israeli provocations that it suffered. I think they don't want to give the election to Mr. Trump. I think Biden is bidding for some kind of dramatic increase in the war to rally his support for his party. So this is a big factor, and it's never talked about, really. And I think in the case of the Russians, they see the United States weakening itself, weakening its allies, not strengthening them. And let me just say a word about that. You know, blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline has resulted in the deindustrialization of Germany, the most powerful economy in Europe. And it has galvanized Europeans. And now that you have a report from the former Italian Prime Minister, Finance Minister, Mario Draghi, which takes Europe to task and says basically, we're finished unless we reform and open. In Pacific Asia, the United States has dropped out of all the discussions of how to structure trade and investment. We're not present. That is being done by ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Japan, South Korea, and China. We're not in that. And you look at what's happening, we are less and less influential, not to say no longer in control. So if you're Mr. Putin, you look at this, or if you're Mr. Xi Jinping, you look at this and say, you know, why interrupt the enemy when he's making a mistake? And so we go to Kazan, and the big item there is a purported currency exchange reform, which would, follow. Iraq apparently just agreed to conduct its oil trade with China in Chinese currency. This kind of thing is broadening. The role of the dollar is being reduced, and Kazan promises to produce some sort of innovation in this regard, which would be a real blow at American primacy globally. It's also going to be attended apparently by about 100 countries. So this is a more consequential meeting in terms of the attendees, in terms of the agenda, than we should be comfortable with. But we haven't done anything. Just the other day, there was a major demand from developing countries that we knock off our unilateral sanctions, which, by the way, they pointed out are illegal under the UN Charter, but they're now one of the few foreign policy instruments we actually wield. We've managed to alienate much of the world, and it's showing. And so I would say, if you take the view that, as the Russians do, that you should evaluate the strength of adversaries comprehensively, we're not showing too much strength.
So what would be the calculation in the Kremlin to say, okay, we see that the U.S. is weakening, but if they expand by authorizing the use of the long-range weapons, and you have strikes like what happened at the Tver ammo depot, but other more important strategic targets that are hit by a Western missile. What is the calculus from the Russian side to say, all right, let's continue to be patient, which you said they've done a lot. Well, all right, now then that's the final line. Now then, no matter what, we're going to expand and hit targets of theirs, wherever.
Well, they've told us that. That's what a state of war, as opposed to the special military operation, which is a way of describing a limited conflict. State of war is a general state of war. And that's what Mr. Putin has promised in return for this apparent decision to authorize Ukraine to fire.
Do you think he's bluffing, or do you think he would actually do it?
I don't see that much record of his having bluffed on much of anything. Back in December 2021, when he's basically issued an ultimatum, either you negotiate with us about returning Ukraine to neutrality and not entering it in NATO, and you negotiate with us about protections for the Russian speakers in Ukraine, and you open a discussion with us about broader European security arrangements that would relieve the threat to us as well as to you, or I'm going to use force. You got two bits of response out of Washington. One, he'd never dare use force. It's all a bluff. And number two, oh, he's aggressive. He's going to use force. And here's how he's going to do it. And he's going to walk right over Ukraine. I would say the people who made both judgments need to be severely disciplined, because both were foolish.
And now that we are where we are, so I guess what do you say to those people like Jack Keane, like Lindsey Graham, who's of course biggest cheerleader for more war, or Ben Hodges, or any of these number of these other people? They all say he's not going to do it because they claim he knows that there would be a bigger response and he couldn't handle because anything that would happen outside of Ukraine into Europe pretty much is going to be an Article 5 trigger. And so he says, they claim that Putin wouldn't do that because he knows he can't handle it. What do you say to that argument?
I say that is extremely risky. It's not a bet that I would want to take. And I don't think the people who are making that bet have any understanding at all of either European history, the role of Russia in European security, and they don't know Mr. Putin, and they don't know the Russians. And so they are basically, what is the word? I'm looking for a word that somebody who pretends to know something and absolutely doesn't know a damn thing about it.
An
There
idiot.
are a lot of them on TV, and the fact that you're on TV may appear to give you authority, but it's a spurious authority. So I think we'd all be better off if they would stay home, and not go on TV. But better yet, don't pay any attention to them, because they're going to get us in real trouble. They have gotten us in trouble. I ticked off some of the things that have been happening to us. Are Americans very happy these days? Are we disgruntled and somewhat despondent? Is there joy, as Kamala Harris proposes? I don't see it.
We just need more bombs, Mr. Ambassador. Then we'll
Well,
get
that's
that.
right. If we have enough bombs, we can cure climate change. We can end nuclear proliferation. We can make the Middle East safe for Jewish supremacy in Israel. There's nothing we can't do if we have enough bombs, right?
Right. Yeah, that's the apparent solution. I mean, we parody that and laugh at it, but gosh, it seems like some people somehow seem to believe that. There is at least one recent movement I've seen, I guess, to where at least some people are looking a little bit further than this current environment, and they recognize that we are going to have to live with Russia on the end, and certainly it's going to. Nobody's going away. Nobody's going to be removed from the map, so we're going to have to get along at some point or another. And the Council on Foreign Relations has a report out this month where they're saying from Ukraine conflict to a secure Europe. So on the headline, I was thinking, okay, well, that sounds good. At least somebody's looking to try and go something forward. But when you read into the details of it, even this otherwise positive thought process, away from just more bombs, still bases its understanding on Russia is an expansionist impulse. There wasn't any reason for it to invade Ukraine. It just did because it's in their DNA. They just have to invade people all the time. And then it says that European security will have to be grounded in deterrence and defense, not diplomacy, which I found curious in there. What do you say when you hear this article?
That it's exactly what the Russians and Chinese say about us. We each regard the other as irrational, belligerent adversary. We do stuff, we invade country. By the way, other than Ukraine, where we got a fair warning from Moscow that if we went ahead with NATO enlargement, we were going to get a war in Ukraine. So that in that sense, it was provoked by us. We should have known that what we were going to get. Other than that, who else has Russia invaded? And who has China invaded in the last 40-some years? Who have we invaded? Lots of countries. You actually participated in a couple of invasions, I believe.
I did.
So you have more experience against scruffy insurgents than anybody. But that's not what the war in Ukraine is.
No.
It's not about scruffy insurgents. It is a conventional battle that resembles World War I in terms of its level of ferocity and the difficulty of securing any kind of advance. And here I would like to say, going back to your earlier questioning of Putin and nuclear doctrine, we have just issued a nuclear doctrine premised on fighting and winning a nuclear war. That is the central element of what the Biden administration's recently announced nuclear doctrine is aimed at. This, despite the fact that Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev together correctly said a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. But we are planning to fight and win a nuclear war, according to the statement of our nuclear doctrine. That is very dangerous.
Gary, do you still have that Jeffrey Sachs video loaded up? Is that still available? I'd like to have your comment as we close up here today. Jeffrey Sachs is on the All In podcast along with a number of other people here recently, where he made an interesting comment about how we like to view things. And you can hear a part of this in stuff that Ted Cruz said a second ago, which is basically everybody's against us and we have to go out and defend ourselves here. But Professor Sachs had a different take on that. Watch this.
Almost all the time that we intervene, it's because we view this as a power situation for the U.S. So whether it's Ukraine or Syria or Libya or other places, even if we define it as defending something, believe me, it's not about defending something. It's about a perception of U.S. power and U.S. interest, and it's in objectives of U.S. global hegemony. And if we analyze the Ukraine conflict just even a little bit below the surface, this is not a conflict about Putin invading Ukraine. This is something a lot different that has to do with American power projection into the former Soviet Union. So it's completely different.
Now, you just made the comment that that's exactly how Russia and China view us. Is there any possibility at all that we can change the lens and see ourselves from the perspective of others, from the perspective that we would see them if they did the same actions with us, so that we can wake up and maybe make some decent policies choices? Do you even see a possibility of that?
Well, we're about to have an election. Do you see any evidence that either of the major candidates in that election is looking introspectively at us and connecting our actions with the effects they provoke on the part of others? I don't. So the answer to your question is yes, that's something we absolutely should do. We would benefit greatly by becoming realistic, by applying empathy to those we consider to be our adversaries, not sympathizing with them, not agreeing with them, but understanding why they're doing what they're doing and where they're coming from, and therefore how to persuade them not to do it, which is the task of diplomacy. The diplomacy is about convincing people, especially adversaries, that they should see things the way we see them, that they should regard doing what we see as in our interest as also in their interest, and in fact, more in their interest than what they have previously been doing. You can't do that if you don't understand yourself from their perspective and you don't understand them in terms of their motivations. This is, going back to Sun Tzu, the great Chinese theoretician of war. He said, 知己知彼, understand yourself, understand the other, and you will never be defeated. And that is still true, but we don't try.
Well, I'd love to be able to argue with you on that one, but I don't see any path to that, and certainly neither of the major candidates, with the possible exception of Trump and the Russia-Ukraine situation, at least has some interest in finding a negotiated settlement. But other areas, it's not so clear that that's the path, or that he would actually do it if he got into office. We'll find out whether that comes to pass or not. But
Ukraine needs peace. Ukraine needs peace. So do we. we know that we have to have a peaceful international environment to fix all of the problems we've allowed to accumulate at home. And that means collapsing infrastructure, declining educational standards. It means levels of interference by the government with privacy and the rights of the citizens that ignore the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, and so forth. In order to fix these, we need a peaceful international environment. Step one ought to be bringing peace to Ukraine. And we should be backing the Ukrainians as much as we can in trying to salvage as much from this terrible situation as they can. But I will say there is no instance I know of where people have won back at the negotiating table what they've lost on the battlefield.
Yeah.
The Ukrainians have to be
never heard of it.
realistic. I've never seen that.
Yeah, and I'm very confident you won't see it here either. So we'll see how all this works out, especially at the UN General Assembly, see what's said, what announcements are made. A lot of implications, both pro and con, depending on what does or doesn't come out of Washington after that. But as we say, we shall see. Thank you very much for coming on today, Mr. Ambassador. As always, we're very grateful for your poignant insights and experience that you've had. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny.
And also want to remind you guys that we are now on podcasts because I know a lot of you don't get a chance to see every video here, but sometimes you get a chance to listen. So anywhere that you get your podcast, it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, really anywhere you do, just type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive and you will find the podcast waiting for you there. Thank you very much. We'll see you later this afternoon at 3:00. Revenge around the world. Strikes have been going on in Russia. Strikes have been going on in Lebanon. And what are the recipients of those going to do in response? We're going to talk about both of those this afternoon at 3 p.m. Tune in then. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't, because that really helps us all out. Thanks, and we'll see you at 3:00 today.